Recording should be started. All right, welcome everyone to Amos Day 2, Amos Conference Day 2, the third session of Lightning Talks. We have an incredible selection of Lightning Talks. We have five talks, and then we're gonna hold the questions until the end, but feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the, I think, 15 minutes after the talks, but the talks are about 5 minutes long. And just for the speakers, if you do start to go quite over, I'll just send you a little direct message and say, hey, wrap it up. And you all should have co-host privileges, which will allow you to share your screen if you want. And I'll turn it over to our first speaker, who may share his screen whenever he wants, Harrison Hansford, talking about sports science, journal policy, promotion, and transparency and open research. I think you're muted, but you know that.
There we go. Thank you very much. I'll just see if I can make this actually full screen. Yep, can you see that okay? Perfect. So I'm Harrison Hansford, and I am an honours student at UNSW and Neuroscience Research Australia. And today I'll be talking about how well sports science journal policies promote transparency and openness. And this will be a summary of our feasibility and audit and feedback intervention. So, as I'm sure you all know, I don't probably need to talk about it too much, the reproducibility crisis has been identified in psychology, neuroscience, as well as sports science and countless other fields. And journal policies often shape research which is published, and they have the ability to improve reporting, as we've seen with things like Consort being mandated, as well as the Prisma for meta-analyses, as well as support good practice. And so our study aimed to evaluate the feasibility of an audit and feedback intervention to facilitate journal policy change. And our secondary aim was to determine the reliability of the trust policy evaluation form, which I'll discuss in a second. And finally, to look at sports science journal policy support for transparent and open research practices. So we audited the top 38 sports science journals by impact factor, and we looked at their policies in May 2021 using the trust form. And this form was essentially operationalizing the transparency and openness promotion guidelines, or top guidelines, as you probably know them. We assessed the reliability and the agreement of the trust form using an inter-class correlation coefficient 2:1, which I'll talk about in a second, and the standard error of measurement. We determined the feasibility of our intervention to be used at a larger scale, and we also sent, as part of our intervention, tailored letters to the editor to all 38 journals with feedback of how their policies fared against the rest of the journals, I guess. So in terms of feasibility, we analysed it as the time taken to rate the policies and create the letter. So we determined it was feasible if it took less than 30 minutes to rate and less than 45 minutes to create the letters. We use an inter-class correlation coefficient, which was two-way random effects, absolute agreement, and we used the multiple raters model because we were doing it in triplicate. And we also used the standard error of measurement for more absolute reliability. And to stratify it all, poor reliability was less than an ICC of 0.5. And then, as you can see, all the way up to greater than 0.9, which was excellent. And in terms of journal scores, we rated the policies using the trust form, which has a range of 0, which is absolutely no support for transparency and open guidelines, as well as up to 27, which means they're doing a very, very good job. And this is based on the top standards. And the standards are data and code citation, data, code, reporting, design and analysis, as well as materials, transparency, replication, and study pre-registration. So what did we find? We found that for a total of 19 hours to rate all the journals in triplicate, and this equated to roughly 9 minutes per rater on average. And it took us 18 hours to prepare and submit the letters. And this is about 29 minutes per journal. We found the reliability was moderate with an ICC of 0.68. And importantly, the lower bound is generally what we like to use to determine reliability. And that was just in the moderate area. And the overall standard error of measurement was 1.18. We did also look at the smallest detectable change, which is a function of the standard error of measurement. And that was about 3 points out of 27. So it has fair kind of discrimination ability. But it's important to note, with the sample we had, which will make more sense next slide, many individual items had little variation because the journals just all scored 0 on each item or some of the items. And thus the reliability was very poor. And for one of the items wasn't even determinable because there was literally no variation. So this may have affected our results a little bit. And in terms of how the sports science journals actually did, the mean score on the trust form was 2 out of 27. And the range was 0 to 7. So as you can see, it's not too good. And they didn't fare too well on the form. And 8 of the 9 standards had a median score of 0. And the only one that had a median greater than 0, of 1, was design analysis transparency. And this is just, is there a reporting guideline which is mandated to be used? And this might be something like Prisma for meta-analyses or Consort as well. So, and that's only for certain study types. So as you can see, there's a lot of room for improvement, which I think is exciting in the field of sports science in terms of transparency and openness. And we did get some nice qualitative feedback from journal editors saying that they weren't aware of all these things and that it would be really good to build on it. And they had a lot of questions about how to do that. So I think it's a good sign for the future. And here are some acknowledgements. And if you want to see other research done by the Trust Group, you can just scan the QR code and there's about 300 journals there. So you can see how they all fare. But thank you very much.
There are some really great, rigorous work there. Thank you. And
thank you.
Yeah, I would say it's a better picture than some of the fields I look at. So something to build on. So we'll turn to our next lightning talk speaker, Kylie Papparlado. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
No, that's right. You got that right. Thank you. I'll just share my screen.
And this is a talk titled "The National Plan for Australian Open Access. Is it any good?"
Can everybody see that screen okay? Excellent.
It's great.
Fabulous. So yes, my name is Kylie Papparlado. I am a senior lecturer and researcher in the law school at the Queensland University of Technology. So I want to talk very briefly in the lightning talk today about the Chief Scientist's recently announced National Plan for Open Access, and also a little bit about an ARC-funded project that I'm on with colleagues around Australia, including Professor Kylie Papparlado, who's here today as well, which is looking at the management of knowledge and research in Australian universities. And of course, open access is a big part of that and of our project. So before I talk or explain a little bit more about the Chief Scientist's plan, I did want to just briefly mention some of the figures that motivated her, at least in part, to propose her model. So I know I'm preaching to the converted here in terms of the importance of open access, but I thought that some of the economics that she drew from were quite illuminating. So she published these figures in an article in the Australian Quarterly in October. And in that article, she explained that between subscription fees for journals and article processing charges, which are those upfront open access fees, Australian universities are paying anywhere between $460 million and $1 billion per year to publishers, partly because article processing charges can be very high. Some are around $10,000 US for a single article. And I think it's also worth noting how lucrative the academic publishing industry is. The Chief Scientist highlighted that it's worth around $10 billion US. And Elsevier alone made $2 billion in profit in 2019. So this is motivation for the Chief Scientist's proposed national model for open access. And really what she has proposed is a central fund of money, which will be administered by an independent body, we don't know who yet, but a non-university body, to essentially negotiate with publishers to pay subscription and article processing charges from that central fund in order to provide open access to knowledge for all universities and all people in Australia. So this proposed model relies very heavily on what are known as transformative agreements, or sometimes called read and publish agreements. And these have been pushed heavily recently in Europe as part of what is known as Plan S. And what transformative agreements are in brief, and of course they differ from agreement to agreement, but basically an institution will negotiate with a publisher to pay a certain amount of money, which will cover both subscriptions to that publisher's journal, but also open access fees for that institution's researchers to publish in journals going forward. And these transformative agreements tend to be limited by time. So sometimes they're for 1 year, sometimes they are for a few years. 3 years is pretty standard. And they differ in terms of how many open access fees are covered under the agreement. So sometimes there are limits on the amount of articles that the institution's researchers can publish open access under that transformative agreement without having to pay more article processing charges down the line. So the chief scientist's proposed model essentially relies on a central national body negotiating these transformative agreements on behalf of Australian universities and paying for them out of a central fund. In our project, we have a few concerns about transformative agreements and about the model. I think the intention behind it is very good. The chief scientist, I think, is trying to take some of the pressure off universities having to negotiate these agreements on their own. But the problem is that transformative agreements they're not actually very transformative, in short. They do not disrupt existing market structures. They don't rely on publishers having to change their business models very much at all. It's still paying quite exorbitant amounts of money to publishers to make knowledge available. The agreements themselves are also not transparent. They tend to be governed by or include confidentiality clauses, which means it's very hard to know what the terms of those agreements are and how much money is being negotiated as part of those agreements. And that's on purpose, right? That's to stop competition between universities for better fees. In terms of the chief scientist's proposed model, there are some questions about how that central pool will be funded. The chief scientist has indicated that it's probably going to come from existing university budgets, not new government funding. And so that's a bit unclear where that's coming from, given that budgets have been tight. And also, it's not clear how the funds will be distributed. It's very likely that agreements will be made first with the big publishers and for STEM journals, meaning that smaller independent Australian journals or Haas journals might suffer as the pool runs dry. They might not be included. And what that means is going forward that academics might be encouraged to publish in those journals that are covered by the agreements and by the pool, further concentrating publishing into an already narrow market. I know Jason just said my time is up, which is fair enough. I do just want to just quickly say that we have some ideas about what might happen instead. And I'm very happy to talk more about our project in the Q&A, but basically we think we can probably be a little bit more transformative and disruptive than those transformative agreements propose by leveraging university IP a little bit better in this space. And we can happy to take questions about that in Q&A. But thank you.
Thanks so much, Kylie. There are already some questions for you in the Q&A. Maybe you could, some quite sizable ones. and we'll pick that up in the Q&A, or you're free to respond to them now. And great to see someone else from law at these conferences for a change. Next speaker is Ilias. If you're all set.
Yes, I think so.
Mandatory open data policies, increase error correction, and ecology and evolution. So I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, hello, everyone. My name is Ilias, and I'd like to start off by thanking you for being here today to this great lightning session. To start off, just going. Open data policies are a type of journal data policy that require data to be freely available to the public. They provide a lot of benefits to academics and science in whole. They provide acceleration of scientific discoveries. They also provide improvements to scientific integrity and rigor. Researchers that have access to freely available data may use them to validate research that has already been published. And in cases where data anomalies were identified, can lead to corrections or even retractions based on the severity of the errors. So even with these benefits, we still, as researchers, face some challenges when it comes to these open data policies. One of the challenges is just keeping up with changes to these policies. There are so many fields of research, and within all of these fields, there are so many journals that are constantly updating their policies. And so as researchers, we can get overwhelmed at seeing so many variations of similar policies. Another challenge is actually determining the benefits of these mandatory open data policies using empirical evidence. So there are still some skeptics that understand the theoretical benefits of these open data policies, but need more empirical evidence to be convinced that it's worth adopting such practices. So here I'm going to present two objectives that help address these challenges. The first objective is to generate a living database with information on data policies, specifically in this case for journals in ecology and evolution, because those are fields that I'm interested in myself, in hopes of creating this all-in-one database for researchers to use in order to reduce some of this confusion and help keep up with changes in these policies. And the second objective is to examine how these data policies have affected error correction rates after implementation in these journals in ecology and evolution. So to start off, we collected data on these journal data policies for 199 journals in ecology and evolution. Specifically, we're interested in two aspects or two traits. That is the mention of public data archiving as well as data availability statements. Using these two traits, we categorized these journals into one of four tiers. So tier one consisted of journals that had no data policy or no mention of either of these two traits in their data policy. Journals in tier two recommended open data practices, but did not require them for publication in their journals. Journals in tier three required a data availability statement in order to publish in their journals, whereas journals in tier four have a mandatory open data policy that required public data archiving for publication. So after we sorted all of these journals in these four tiers, we were curious to see, do these tiers relate to or are associated to the impact that these journals have within their fields. And so here I present the distribution of journal impact factor for all of these journals separated by their appropriate journal policy tiers. And we also have the mean journal impact factor on the table to the right. We found that of all of our journals, 40 journals, that's about 20% of them, had a mandatory open data policy, and that these journals actually had a higher impact factor on average than journals with less stringent policies. One of the reasons this is it could be that these more prestigious journals have adopted open data policies and practices earlier or sooner than other journals in their field. With regards to the second objective, whether these policy types have an influence on error correction rate, we first collected information on article retractions using the wonderful database called Retraction Watch that has information about retracted articles across many fields, including ecology and evolution. And we use this data to compare the total number of retractions per year for journals before and after their data policies were implemented. Now, for the sake of comparison, journals that did not have information on implementation date were assigned an approximate implementation date of 2016, which was the average implementation date for the journals with which we did have data on. So there's something to keep in mind for the following slides. But here I'm going to present the results of paired permutation tests that we did for each one of our 4 tiers to see if there is actually a change in error correction rate after implementing such policies. So for journals in our first tier, that is journals without data policies, we saw that the number of retractions per year were similar before and after this approximate implementation date. Similar results can be found for journals that recommend open data but do not require it, as well as journals that require data availability statements but do not require public data archiving. So we see that it's the rates of error correction or error identification are similar before and after policy implementation. However, for journals that require open data, we see a significant positive effect here when it comes to error correction rates. So after implementing their policies, there's a significantly more number of retractions identified per year in these journals. This is exactly what we expected in the context that these mandatory data policies improve our ability to not only detect errors, but also correct and account for these errors to improve the academic rigor in these fields of research. So with all that, I want to thank you all for attending, and I look forward to the question and answer period to come.
Incredible stuff, Ilias. Very, very promising. Huh? I think it's nice to see that there's not a big drop in impact factor, or they don't have lower impact. So our next speaker is Rafael.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, bit of an echo, but we can hear you. Rafael's talk is Science as a Productive Force and Reproducibility in Times of Organic Crisis of Capital. So I'll turn it over to
Tell
you.
me if the echo is too much. My name is Rafael Rocha. I'm talking from Brazil. I am a doctoral candidate in the University of the State of Rio de Janeiro. And I discuss my research, the entanglement between science and society in times of crisis of capital. The recognition of the replication crisis and the debate that followed allowed the growth of a community of researchers with the sincere objective of correcting distortions on how knowledge is accumulated. All the steps, we have already talked about a lot of them, that have been insipidly, it's important to stress that this, taken in the last years are very important. For example, a better understanding of statistical concepts by researchers from different areas, change in the editorial model, the metrics are beginning to be problematized with the relativization of the impact factor, changes in fundings, many initiatives. But although all those are very important, I think they are insufficient. We have a problem, that is, how can we be sure that the measures we are taking to fix the problem aren't only exercising a merely performative reproducibility? How can we be sure we are not creating new cargo cults like the one described by Feynman, when we do everything as expected, but in reality we are not getting good answers. Otherwise, we will be eternally condemned to roll a stone uphill, or as we say here in Brazil, to dry ice. This image, you can keep on drying ice and it's always going to be wet. The dynamics of the reality of scientific reproduction as it exists today will probably cause those measures to be also circumvented. Regulations attempts on social behaviors without further reflection on their underlying causes are not the best way to control concrete practice. Behavior epidemiology is an example of that. Just telling people not to eat sugar or not to smoke does not work. Or other example, in the case of economical science, regulations have also not prevented scenarios that, like the ones that led to the 2008 economical crisis. Indeed, I think we are living one right now. The embarrassment to the independent verification of the knowledge produced has several distinct technical causes. Statistical problems, communications, publish or perish, but they also exist because of underlying causes that reside on how science is produced. They reflect the gears through which capital commands and appropriates scientific work. The gears of scientific production and communication are coupled since the 18th century with those of the cycle of rotations of capital. Considering a broader sense of the term science, not just what mankind started to do of the 18th century revolution, but science since the beginning of the mankind, since we produced the first tools, has had a dual nature since its inception. The first astronomers who looked to the sky to predict decisions, so they could use this in agriculture. They were also projecting the stars, the social order in which they lived. Science exists at the same time as an accumulation of objective knowledge needed for societal reproduction, at the same time as it exists as an institution to justify the social order, a role that was earlier from religion alone. Subsumed to capitalist relations, science as a commodity, science becomes captive of the process of producing surplus value, at the same time that science is also responsible for, science has been responsible for capitalism dynamism since the Industrial Revolution, and now through the automation of production provided by artificial intelligence, its potential, it's one of the responsible for making also it an obsolete mode of production, as surplus cannot be extracted from robots. Because of this dialectical relation, science has a cost of economical crisis, but also affected by it, science is diverted to attain the system's needs of social justification. Failing to take that in account can lead to tragic consequences. We hear about recent news of potential catastrophes only made possible by scientific activity. Researchers working with resistant bacteria report a worsening of the situation due to the unjustified overuse of antibiotics since the beginning of the pandemic. This is an old problem, but it has intensified a lot in these last years. In Brazil, a recent paper reports that the abuse of ivermectin has created resistant scabies causing mites. The COVID-19 pandemic made it clear that the science we have, the way it is financed, produced, and disseminated, despite its gigantism, is different from the one we need to guarantee the survival of our species for decades to come. It has failed in the face of complex problems. In this case, we should follow the reasoning of epidemiology, in search always of the big why, the search for the causes of the causes. From the search of the most general determinants, the answer is always in the big picture, in the interaction between the natural and the social. In many scientific fields, the object is almost always a cutout that excludes from the core of the analysis as external factors the influence of the social whole. This abstinency that consists in excluding social relations from the consideration of different scientific problems, naturalize them, is one of the factors behind the crisis in science. In a chapter from 1995 book, Dinosaur in a Haystack, called Cordelia's Dilemma, Stephen Jay Gould starts talking about something we're all familiar with, publication bias, the lack of publishing of negative results. But then he moves on to something more elusive and interesting. I will quote him. What if our conceptual work excludes the possibility of acknowledging a negative result as a phenomenon at all? What if we simply can't see or even think about a different and meaningful alternative? It's much easier to use statistics to hunt for some outliers than describing bias shared by a whole community of researchers. Thank you, and I will appreciate to be here to the questions.
Thanks, Rafael. Really interesting stuff. Final speaker, Thomas Shafee.
Hi everyone, I'll just share my screen. So yeah, I'm going to be talking a bit about a few different models and why those models work for integrating the scientific journal publishing process with Wikipedia as kind of an outreach and science communication platform. And the background to this is largely around readership number and demographic scope. So even the top 5% of journal articles are typically only ever read a few thousand times across their entire lifespan. And this is dwarfed by the annual readership of just an average Wikipedia page, let alone that kind of equivalent top 5% Wikipedia page. And additionally, of course, Wikipedia has a much broader audience demographic, and we often think about the general public in this very nebulous sense, but you've got to remember that it also includes researchers from other fields, some of whom may be reviewing your grants, as well as students. It's a key learning location, patients making health decisions, as well as journalists, clinicians, lawmakers, and these are just the demographics for which we actually have studies showing their use of Wikipedia. It's likely the case in a number of other key demographics. And of course, over the last couple of years, this has all been completely dwarfed by the sort of readership that COVID-19 information has been getting on the site. So the question is, given that academics in general don't tend to contribute directly to Wikipedia very often, largely because of incentive structures, what are the ways in which we can encourage that sort of behavior and kind of combine the best of both worlds? And really thinking on this went back to really 2008, when the journal RNA Biology started requiring authors to either write a new Wikipedia page or update the existing Wikipedia page if they were publishing on a new RNA biology gene family. And so they'd write alongside their journal article, they'd also write a short Wikipedia article. So this is kind of a parallel publishing model. A few years later, PLOS Computational Biology came up with this concept of a topic page review format. So these are essentially encyclopedic style review articles, very broad review articles of a topic that first get published in the journal, in this case, PLOS Computational Biology, and then get copied across wholemeal into Wikipedia, usually creating a new Wikipedia page on that topic where none existed before. And these were joined by kind of a journal doing the reverse. So the first example of taking an existing Wikipedia page and applying journal peer review to it was Open Medicine, which put the Wikipedia page for dengue fever through academic peer review. And obviously the corrections and updates that the peer reviewer suggested to that were also used to improve the Wikipedia article. And so since 2014, a set of journals have also started up that kind of specialize in these formats alongside the other journals that have them as one of many formats that they run. And so I'll quickly note those journals here because I think that they're quite a useful case study. So the original one was Wiki Journal of Medicine, and subsequently Wiki Journal of Science and Humanities started up in 2018, and Wiki Journal of Psychology, Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences is due to start up next year. And they have a shared preprint server where articles are drafted and kept whilst they're being peer reviewed. And in particular, I think they are interesting because they combine a number of features that are relatively unusual in the publishing ecosystem. Firstly, they're both open access, but also free to publish. So some people might know that as Diamond Open Access. And that's possible because they're supported by the Wikimedia Foundation. So they have funding from a not-for-profit, and also all of the staff currently are fully volunteer. Additionally, they do public peer review. So firstly, all of the peer review comments and author responses are publicly readable alongside the articles themselves. And in addition, about 80% of reviewers agree to have their identity open, even those that request anonymity, their fields of expertise are listed. So for example, if you've got some article that is multidisciplinary, you know whether the reviewers that have looked at it cover all of those disciplines. And then obviously the last one I've mentioned, that they're Wikipedia integrated, and that may be for whole articles getting copied into Wikipedia, for sections of articles getting copied into Wikipedia, or even articles that are based around a single summary, schematic or diagram, having that summary schematic integrated into multiple Wikipedia articles. The last thing to note is that this is part of a much wider open knowledge ecosystem that I think that there's a lot of potential for greater collaboration between. And I think that this way of bridging that academia to Wikipedia gap is just kind of the first part of tying all of this network more closely together. If it's the sort of thing that you might be interested in, there's various ways to contribute, ranging from submitting an article, reviewing a submitted article. There's various materials online that you can share with others if you think that people, others who might be interested. And also, if you ever come across topics that are poorly covered on Wikipedia, feel free to just contact us and say, hey, the Wikipedia page on important topic X is only a paragraph long. You should invite someone to write a review article on that. And finally, if you want to get super involved, you can join the editorial board, and we also have an open meeting a few times a year. I'll stick in the chat the link to the open meeting that's coming up this Saturday morning.
Thanks so much, Thomas. I have some questions about the peer review there, the quality and quantity of peer review, but there's a long queue of questions, so I should respect that. So we have about 8 minutes for questions. I noticed there were two for Kylie, both around Born Open journals and the open access plan, if you wanted to speak to that.
Yeah, sure. The transformative agreements and the extent to which they cover born open journals that are part of a publisher's sort of collection, where the publisher does both subscription and born open journals, is still a bit unclear. To the extent that journals are born open and that they are open to everybody and there are no fees for payment, then obviously that, in our opinion, is the best way to go, and those will not be affected too much by any by the proposed national OA plan. The risk, though, is that the plan sort of will further entrench hybrid journals, or publishers that are kind of playing both sides of the fence, which I think is the risk there.
Kylie, can you say something about the QUT policies and whether you see that as potentially scaling up to a national model, where I know more than a decade ago, maybe 20 years ago, the policy of trying to get all academics to deposit on the university repository prior to, or I'm not sure the exact policy, and maybe you could remind us of that and whether you think that will scale up.
Yeah, sure. And I would like to throw to Kathy in a second, actually, in case she's got some extra things to say on this. But the QUT approach is an interesting one, because QUT has always gone quite heavy on its repository, but they have also structured the IP policies at a university level to assert that QUT as the institution owns IP in the research and the research publications generated by their academics, which is not the norm across institutions. The problem with QUT is that it implemented that policy with the goal that having the weight of the university behind academics would help them negotiate with publishers to not assign copyright and to keep the rights to put into the QUT repository and all of that. But most academics are not aware of this policy. There's no support in terms of people kind of educating them about it, talking to publishers on their behalf. The academics still just sort of go in and sign publishing agreements that give away their copyright. And then we're sort of left with a mess where we don't know, like, is their publishing agreement not valid now? Is the QUT policy just not going to be enforced in this instance? So part of what we're doing with our project is looking across within institutions in Australia, but also across institutions, to see sort of what the policies are, how they're managed, and how they can be both streamlined in Australia, but also given a bit more weight, so we don't end up with just lots of universities with a QUT-like situation where the policies are good, but there's no action behind it, really. Kathy, did you want to say anything else?
I just want to add there that I don't think it's just the, it's easy to blame academics as not understanding it or not caring about open access or whatever. But the other side of the equation is that when all the Australian universities, and there's only 40 of them, have actually different IP policies, it's actually not possible for publishers to actually understand what our policies are and support open access in the terms that our institutions require it. So one of the agendas of our project is to actually try and get some kind of harmonisation of principles, which would include quite strong open access principles across the sector, which would then remove from the equation the publishers saying they actually don't understand what the institutional requirements are. And it will also mean that we could also craft our policies so that if the publishers issue contracts which are not supportive of open access in an appropriate manner, that the publisher bears the legal risk and their publishing agreement is invalid. It's tricky because it actually requires policies that actually make the university the first owner of copyright for that to work. But that's, in a sense, where we're heading in relation to this. Not necessarily in terms of, for those people who publish and get royalties, that they wouldn't be entitled to the beneficial ownership or any royalties that generated. It's not a funding grab, but simply dealing with the way that multinationals can pick and choose and in a sense, play us all off against each other.
Thanks, Kathy and Kylie. Just moving down my queue, Ilias, there's a question for you from Jenny asking, is it possible to attribute those retractions to the open data policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I also had someone else interested as well, that concept. It is. I found it challenging to create that causal relationship between these policies and the retractions based on. So whenever the retraction is published, there's a retraction notice by the journal saying X article is retracted for whatever reason, but these tend to be somewhat vague. So as I was collecting the data, I took a small sample of the retractions in the database, and I looked at these retraction notices, and I found that just as commonly, just as I mentioned, half of them were pretty vague, and others had some sort of indicator that there's an error identified by the authors that chose to retract it, or an external review or external comment from a third party. So there is some evidence that there is some sort of causal relationship there, but it is challenging to parse this from any other factors that could be causing retractions or even corrections to be identified. But what I think the most important relationship that we identified there was that in the three other tiers that we categorized, the comparisons between retraction rates before and after the policies were implemented were very similar, whereas these policies that mandated open data had a drastic increase in error retraction rates. So I'm not sure what the actual mechanism is. It's not as clear as I'd like, but it's definitely something that I'm interested in exploring a bit more.
I know Dan Hamilton's here. He's done some research, like actually talking to editors, so maybe that's the next step. We have 1 minute, Thomas, if you want to address Jenny's question about gender bias.
Yeah, so that's something that's well known. So within Wikipedia, the background is that about 80% of editors on Wikipedia are male. And so within the Wiki Journals, our demographics sit either side of that, actually. So for authors and editors of Wiki Journal articles, it's about 60% male, which is still not great, but it's at least closer to parity. For peer reviewers, though, it's awful. It's about 90% male peer reviewers. And there's probably a number of social factors that go into influencing that. But one of the things that we do is that all of our data around that is also open data on Wikidata, so you can do your own Spark queries and slice up that data, by region, for example, or by topic if you're interested in drilling down more.
Yeah, thanks. It seems like a serious problem, but good to have the data, as you mentioned. Probably isn't available for most journals. Yeah, thanks again to all our speakers. Really fascinating. Hopefully, maybe some of you can connect because there's a bunch of great questions on the chat that we just didn't get to. But yeah, thank you all again. It's a wonderful session.
Thanks, everyone.